Hello, welcome to Meet the Author. I'm Louis Meyers, the host. This is the show where we talk with authors about their books, about their life experiences, and about the writing process. I am so delighted today to have with us by Zoom from her home in, I believe it's Mid-Hudson Valley, New York, Miss Terri Thal. And I'm going to read the introduction that I have for her, and then we're going to have a chance to talk with her. Miss Thal grew up in Brooklyn. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, she lived in Greenwich Village, hanging out with and managing folk singers, including her husband, Dave Van Ronk, and Bob Dylan, you may have heard of, the Holy Modal Rounders, Maggie and Terry Roche. She was part of this vibrant music scene, as well as a member of socialist organizations. As a campaigner for social justice, Terri went on to work for nonprofit organizations, handling public relations and fundraising, then as executive director of an agency that worked with maternal and child health services in New York's Mid-Hudson Valley. Now retired, she spends her time doing environmental and criminal justice reform work and writing. She is an avid reader, writer, and editor. And my understanding is sometime in the next week or two, she's headed to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Bob Dylan Center is, and she's going to be the keynote speaker there for a symposium on Dylan and all things Dylan. This is her book, which is a wonderful, fascinating book, My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me, and talks about many of her experiences in those early years. So welcome, Miss Thal.
Thank you very much. I am totally delighted to be here.
I want to start with, as you do in the book, talking a little bit about your early life before you went into Manhattan and Greenwich Village. You grew up in Brooklyn. Tell us a little bit about what your life was like in your childhood, teenage years.
Well, at that time, I was born in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which people have read about. It's now the home of, now costs a fortune, and it's the home of a zillion writers and artists and people like that. When I was a kid, Bed-Stuy was a commercial neighborhood. It was a very working class neighborhood. It was multi-ethnic. There were a handful of Jews left. There were a bunch of Italian people, there were Irish Catholic people. People had started moving in from Puerto Rico, and around the corner from us, there were some Gitanos, who people may better understand as gypsies, lived in some of the storefronts. It was, as far as I was concerned, it was home. It was my neighborhood. My parents were Jewish. My mother kept a kosher home. And when I was 11, they moved us to Flatbush.
Flatbush in Brooklyn.
Still in Brooklyn, yeah.
So you were raised in a Jewish household, and what kind of life did your parents foresee for you?
I have no idea. I think that they thought that I would grow up to be what women did at that time, get married and be a secretary or an administrative assistant, because that's what women did. There was another aspect to me and my life, which is that by the time I was about 13, I was 5'10" and a half. And that affected my life a lot, because I was the tallest woman on the block and in school and everywhere. And it really limited my social life, which might have had something to do with the way I turned out. I don't know, but I was tall, and I was not a big woman. I was a slim woman. That was really, really unusual. In fact, in 1959 at the Newport Folk Festival, I walked into the elevator of the motel where everybody stayed, and my head spun. There was a woman who was taller than me by about 2 inches. And that was a folk singer named Cynthia Gooding, who was, you probably never heard of her, but Cynthia was an international folk singer. She did a lot of international stuff, and she was glorious. And it was just amazing.
Well, you did, how old were you when you went over to Greenwich Village or moved into Manhattan?
When I was in my sophomore year in college, I I looked up and found left liberal and organizations. I was very, very much committed to social justice. I suppose that came from my family's emphasis on treating people well. And I was interested in it in high school, and I started going to socialist meetings of socialist organizations, all of which were in Greenwich Village. I mean, there were like three socialist things in the United States at that time. And in New York, all of them were headquartered in Greenwich Village. And of course, I knew of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. So I started going to meetings of socialist organizations, and I wound up in Washington Square, and I met Dave Van Ronk.
This would have been in the late 1950s, I believe.
I met David in 57.
57. And we'll talk about him in a minute, but you know, there's another book that when I read your book, it reminded me of a book I'd read several years ago. You may know Patti Smith. She wrote the book Just Kids she grew up in New Jersey, came to Manhattan at about the same age you had come to Greenwich Village. And she talked about her life with Robert Mapplethorpe, and then of course, she became the sort of poet icon, poet laureate of the punk movement. But there is some of that excitement about moving from into Manhattan for so many young people of that era, I think, and maybe still.
It was at that time. There was nothing in Brooklyn. I mean, Brooklyn was like people women who wanted to get married, who were looking for husbands. I wasn't. I didn't want China. I didn't want sterling silver. I wanted to change the world. And if I was going to be someplace, Manhattan was the place to do it. And then, of course, David and I had gone together for 2 years, and when I graduated from college in 1959, we got an apartment together, which was rather unusual. We did not get married at that time.
Sure.
1959. That was unusual, and yeah, it was exciting. You know, I was alone. I was on my own. I thought I was a grown up. I was all of 20 years old.
And you met Dave Van Ronk. Now, Dave Van Ronk, for those who don't know of him, was well known in Greenwich Village. I believe he was known as the mayor of MacDougal Street at one point, MacDougal Street being one of the primary streets in Greenwich Village. So he was really a known figure. Tell us about Dave Van Ronk.
David actually grew up in Brooklyn and Queens, and he dropped out of, actually he was thrown out of school. They said to him, the principal said to him, Van Ronk, you're uneducable. And he was one of the smartest people I've ever met. And very self-taught. And he became involved with a traditional jazz band. He shipped out to sea, which people became a merchant seaman, which was sort of an adventure and a way to make a living. And when I met him, he had become a folk singer. He'd become interested in folk music. He brought his jazz background with him, which is one of the reasons why he was somewhat distinctive from anyone else. If you listen to Dave's guitar, you hear jazz back there. You hear Jelly Roll Morton. And he was smart. And I was a socialist, he was an anarchist. We disagreed, sort of. It was interesting because there was no way for a young folk singer to make a living in the late 1950s in New York. There were no clubs, there were no coffee houses, there were no concert halls, there was no nothing. We started an organization called the Folk Singers League, which produced concerts of his peers, him and his peers. And when we moved in together, there still was no place in 59 for a folk singer to work. And I crashed in a teaching license. I got a job teaching social studies in a high school in Chelsea, which is where we lived. It worked out beautifully. And in 1960-ish, people started opening folk music clubs, folk music coffee houses in the village.
Let me step back for a minute. You mentioned a few minutes ago, of course, you believe strongly in social justice and identified as a socialist. Dave was an anarchist. 1959, this attracted the attention of the FBI and perhaps Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was a kid. In 1958, I was like, 19 years old, which was young back then. It was a lot younger than 19 is now. And I was on my way to Brooklyn College to either 19th or 18th century history class, I forget which. And two men stopped me on the street and they said, "Are you Terri?" And I looked at them, and without thinking, I was a child of the McCarthy period. Without thinking, I said, "I don't name names." And we had this weird conversation because I was hanging out. I was not a member, but I was hanging out around a socialist organization. And I don't know what they wanted me to tell them, because as I said to them, you know about me. If you know about me, you know about everybody. You know who's who, you know what they are, you know what they do. I don't. I don't know who's anything. Why are you bothering me? And it was kind of amazing because they did this thing, "You have a sister." And I said, "Yes." They said, "She goes to Brandeis University." My sister was not particularly political. I mean, that was my thing. It wasn't my family's. And they went on to give me details about my sister's life. My sister is 3 years older than me. That were unbelievable. I mean, the time and money that they spent doing research on us was I was mind blown by it. And it wound up with them wanting me to come back and talk to them again. So I said I'd think about it. And actually, this was even before I met Dave. And so it was like 1956. It was 1956. I was a sophomore in college. And I came back and said, "I will talk to you." They said, "If you don't talk to us, we'll go to your parents and tell them about your socialist activities." Well, this was the threat. "We will tell mommy and daddy." So I said, "Go away." Years later, I was working in, I don't know what years, well after I left the folk music world, I went to work for a brokerage house. I was out of my mind. I have no idea why I went to work for a brokerage house. And one day they said, "Everybody's being fingerprinted the next day." And I didn't want to be fingerprinted. I had a thing about it. So I called the civil liberties lawyer and he said, "If you're not fingerprinted, they will send you to jail. And this isn't the time to fight it." So I went to work the next day, still not knowing what I was going to do, and I was fired. And then my landlord told me, and some of my neighbors told me, that the FBI had been asking questions about me. And they said to me, "We told them you're a very nice girl." So, yeah, I had an FBI record. I think it's been thrown away. I tried to get it about 10 years ago, not back then. And I got a note from them saying, "Plunk, you were pitched.
Well, it
So
certainly sounds like you were a dangerous threat to the United States, for sure. At any rate, you did begin to get very involved with the folk music scene, both through Dave Van Ronk, who you would marry, and just because I suppose you were enjoying it. And much of the book is about what that was like in the early 1960s as folk music scene began to really blossom, particularly in Greenwich Village. Tell us about those years. What was it like?
Well, John Mitchell, who was a very strange man, opened the Gaslight. He opened another club, a coffee house, and then he opened the Gaslight on McDougal Street. And he booked poets. He booked beat poets. So he had people like Ted Jones and Leroy Jones and reading there. And it was a basket house. The way basket houses, which many of the coffee houses in the village worked, was somebody would do a performance. In that case, it was poetry, later it was folk music, but they would read, they would do their reading, and then a waitress, always a waitress, never a waiter, would pass a basket, and the audience would put some money in the basket to pay the performer. The club, the coffee houses didn't pay the performer. And if you are an audience, there's a limit to how many times you're going to put your hand in your pocket and pay a performer. So if Ted Jones was on, they had to get rid of the audience. So a new audience would come in to hear Leroy Jones and would put their hands in their pockets. How do you drive out the audience? You bring in folk singers. And John brought in folk singers between the poets, and you know the rest of the story. Within 4 months, the poets were gone for the most part, and folk singers had a place to work. And other coffee houses started opening up. And eventually, within about 2 years, the Gaslight actually started paying salaries, so you didn't have to pass the basket anymore. And then the Bitter End opened around the corner. It was a bit more commercial. And the Village Gate was there, which was a jazz club. It didn't book folk singers. And then the Cafe Ogogo opened, and Gertie's Folk City opened several blocks away, and it was a bar. And it became the place that people came from all over the country to work in. And it was by then, for about 4 years there, about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, it was an incredibly exciting scene. You would walk down the block and literally every couple of stores, there was a coffee house and you could hear folk music. So, and the Gaslight became Dave's home, and it became the place I hung out in. And he did ask me to be his manager. He fired his manager. He got mad at him, and he fired his manager, and he asked me to be his manager. So I was managing him and spending my time in coffee houses in the Gaslight, listening to people like Noel Stokey, who became Paul and Peter, Paul and Mary, the Reverend Gary Davis, Tom Paxton, who became a very good friend, Peter Stamfel, who I wound up managing as part of the Holy Moly Rounders, Danny Kalb, who, well, I knew Danny. Danny was had been a guitar student of Dave's and started the Blues Project, which you may or may not know of. Pat Sky, who actually lived in our building. He lived in the next apartment. Buffy St. Marie, every folk singer, Mississippi John Hurt, who we thought was God, every folk singer in the country came to New York and worked either at the Gaslight or Gertie's or the Bitter End. It was or the Cafe Ogogo. Later on, the Cafe Ogogo featured blues bands, and that's where I heard Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf. The music was incredible.
It really sounds like what we think of now as Nashville or even Austin more recently, where you can walk down a street and there's a critical mass of bars, clubs, performers. But for folk music, it was absolutely Greenwich Village. And then, of course, this began to spread nationally, but perhaps along with Peter, Paul, and Mary, the person that helped it spread nationally was Robert Zimmerman, also, who became Bob Dylan. So tell us about Bob.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Bob Dylan arrives in Greenwich Village. Tell us about when you and Dave first met him and what your impressions were and how that friendship developed.
Well, Dave came home one night and he'd been working or out, and I had been home studying for exams. I was in graduate school for a while. And he said, I just heard this kid, you got to go hear him. He's a genius. So the next night I went down to the Cafe Noir, which was a basket house, where people passed the basket. And I heard this kid, and he was kind of weird. He was not, by my thoughts, he was not a great guitarist. He was barely an adequate singer. His songs were sort of okay. He was doing sort of Woody Guthrie stuff, and but he was sort of amazing in a funny kind of way. He had this strange way of stumbling around, and obviously he was not drunk and he was not stoned. He was not taking drugs, and he had no signs of having had any liquor. And he had this little cap. He would get on stage and doff the cap. A long time later, or not so long later, I realized that I had just seen an imitation of Charlie Chaplin. And his stage presence was great. We became friends. I don't remember exactly how, but we did. Dave and Bob and I became good friends. He was hanging out and sleeping on people's couches. We were one of the couches he slept on, and hanging out in the afternoon, and we were playing records for him. And eventually, and he wanted to work, and we were kind of we played folk music for him, we played blues for him, we played a lot of jazz for him, which he seemed to not like, although years and years later, Bob developed a liking for certain jazz, which he has written about. And he was very, very funny. I can't exactly explain it, but he had a very wry sense of humor. At that time, there were these things called answering services. You didn't get a message on a tape. You paid an answering service, which was a business, to answer your phone when you weren't there. They intercepted the calls, and a person could leave a message, and then I would have to call the women, it was always women, at the answering service and say, do I have messages? And I was getting these strange messages from Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein and some other scientists. And my answering service didn't think it was funny. I mean, they had no idea who these people were. And I was baffled for a while, and I finally realized it was Bob. When Bob called, if I wasn't there or we weren't there, he would leave a strange message. So we became very good friends, and after about 6 months, he said to me one day, would you get me gigs? The only person I was managing was Dave, and I barely thought of myself as a manager. Manager was a business person. I didn't think of myself as a business person, but I was getting Dave gigs and I was negotiating his recording contracts. So Bob said, would you get me gigs? And I said, do you want me to manage you? And he said, okay. we worked out a financial arrangement. I never got a penny. Never, ever, ever. And it was impossible to get him gigs at that time. He didn't need me to get him booked in the basket houses, which didn't pay. I mean, you had to pass a basket. I had nothing to do with that. Dave brought him into the Gaslight to work, and the big thing was he wanted to work in Gertie's Spoke City, which was a liquor club, and in New York had a certain amount of prestige. And nobody would hire him. And it was fascinating because I realized, and I didn't realize this until I wrote this book and I started being interviewed, and something struck me. I have never seen, the folk music world was extraordinarily supportive. People liked each other and they praised each other and they helped each other get gigs and they taught each other songs and music and all kinds of stuff, and they put people up. I have never seen anybody get the kind of support from other folk singers that Bob did. He
That's
was also, I realized, the most, as soon as he hit New York, for some reason, he was the most photographed folk singer in the city, bar none.
One of the photographs, by the way, Terri, if I may, is on the cover of your book. And I guess he was couch surfing because the three of you, I think, are going to breakfast in this picture, if I remember the description of your book.
The picture's kind of, that picture is kind of interesting. Susie, his girlfriend, who became a very good friend of mine, was cropped out by the artists. The people who designed, they said, having poor people spread it too much. And I was kind of annoyed because Susie was a very, very good friend. After Bob and Susie broke up, after I wasn't managing him anymore, Susie and I remained good friends. Susie and Dave remained good friends until cancer took her. And that was photographed by a very well-known rock photographer named Jim Marshall, who wasn't well known then. It was one of his first professional shots. And for some reason, he was hired to shoot Bob. And Bob and Susie and Dave and I went out to breakfast, which we did fairly often. It was a very late breakfast. It was probably like 11 o'clock. And Jim photographed us as we walked through the West Village. He photographed us all the way to wherever we went and had breakfast. And that walk it's called Dillon Walk. And I had no idea at the time. I don't even have a copy of that photograph. Became one of the best known. I know people who have looked at the photographs or, the little shots and traced our route, and they can tell me exactly where we were standing and on what street, in front of what store, in what photograph. I don't remember.
Does it feel strange to you at times to have people know so much about, on a certain level, about your life then or that life when you actually lived it?
No, actually it doesn't, because there has never been any bad mouthing of me. There has never been any criticism of me. There has never been a lot about my very personal life. It's kind of my personal professional life, which was very open. Dave and I ran almost a hotel for people back then. We had people in the house. I remember one night when we had 12 people in the house, and we looked around. We said we didn't invite anybody. We went to a movie, and we came back, and I think one or two of them was still there. I don't remember. So no, not that part of it.
Bob Dylan wrote a book, and it's a very good book, actually. The book chronicles volume 1. I don't think there was ever a volume 2, but it was a fascinating book. It came out in 2004, I believe. He does write about you, and if I can read this paragraph, Von Ronk's wife, Terri, definitely not a minor character, took care of Dave's bookings, especially out of town, and she began trying to help me out. She was just as outspoken and opinionated as Dave was, especially about politics. Not so much the political issues, but rather the highfalutin theological ideas behind political systems. Nietzschean politics, politics with a hanging heaviness. Intellectually, it would be hard to keep up. If you tried, you find yourself in alien territory. Both were anti-imperialistic and anti-materialist. Quote, "What a ridiculous thing, an electric can opener," Terri once said as we walked past the shop window of a hardware store on 8th Street. Who'd be stupid enough to buy that?
Actually, I would. I got to tell you, you reach a certain age and you get an electric can opener. But at that point, we weren't exactly anti-materialist in the sense that we didn't believe in having nice things. David and I did not feel that although we wanted to change the way people treated each other in this country, we didn't like the economic system. We believed social justice. We never took an oath of poverty. We didn't feel that we had to be poor. We realized we were never going to be rich, not through folk music or through my work in, by then I was working in CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and other civil rights and civil liberties organizations. But we didn't feel we couldn't have nice things, I mean, to us, nice things was a record collection, and we amassed a very nice one, records that we played. So that's sort of where I was.
Sure, and that was a time and a place. As you know, the movie that came out this past year, Complete Unknown, I'll ask, have you seen it?
Of course, I saw it. And
so I wanted to talk about the movie. Timothy Chalamet, I thought was tremendous in terms of channeling Bob Dylan. In terms of, but what were your thoughts when you saw? Let's talk about specific roles. Did he capture something about your friend Bob Dylan?
I think he did. I thought the movie. Actually, I thought I would hate the movie. I tend to like fact. Right. I'm very practical. I like fact. And the movie is a biopic. It sort of takes something and it puts pieces together and it creates a story. I thought I'd hate it. I didn't. I liked it. I thought the movie was very well done. I thought Chalamet was good. I thought the music was very, very well done. I really admire what he learned, because he had to learn everything. He had to learn how to play guitar for that. Yeah. And he did. He did it in the movie. That being said, and the arc of the movie, young man comes to New York, young man becomes, starts with a humble, as a humble folk singer. Young man wants more. He wants to change the music. He wants to make different music. Music world is not happy about this. Young man changes the music, goes on to be rich and famous, and leaves all of these people behind. It was very well done. That being said, there are some things about the movie I have a huge problem with. Can you give me 3 minutes?
Of course.
Okay, the first is Susie Rodolo. Bob met Susie, who became his girlfriend, and he was very much in love with her. About 6 months after he hit New York, he met her actually at a concert that I booked him into, uptown Manhattan. And Susie was a very, very bright young woman. She came from a political family. She was interested in art. She studied art. She wanted to be an artist. She taught Bob about art. Bob was not stupid. Bob was not a fool. He had a decent intellectual background. Susie expanded it somewhat. She introduced him to certain poetry, to certain visual art, to Bertolt Brecht, and eventually they broke up because she could not manage being the woman behind the man, which I certainly understand. That was a role I did not play. I managed Dave, but I was not the woman, the young woman hiding behind the guy. Susie became a very good friend. The movie turned Susie into a wimp. Every time you look at Susie, she's crying. I don't know who you are, blah, blah, blah. It's bullshit.
Terri, I will tell you, I had exactly that impression, having read Susie Rotola's book, her memoir, and of course the way that Bob Dylan writes about her in the book. She was such a vibrant, strong, artistic, passionate person, and I totally agree with you that the movie missed that characterization. Let me ask you about Joan Baez in the movie. Now, in your book, you barely mentioned Baez. Of course, when Bob Dylan arrived in Greenwich Village, Baez was already nationally famous. She'd been on the cover of Time magazine. She was sort of the queen of folk music. People around the country knew of her. Did the movie get Joan Baez right?
Yes and no. The movie got Baez's. I didn't know Joan well. So I can't really talk about her, personally, internal stuff. But Joan, I think it did well by her music.
Yeah.
Very well, actually.
I agree.
It did not do well by her relationship with Bob. Joan and Bob met while Bob was still with Susie, but nothing happened. I mean, they met. People met all the time. People went in clubs. They liked each other. They played together. I mean, music. They became friends. Joan did not enter into a thing with Bob and run to New York from Boston every time Susie went away to be in Bob's arms. That just didn't happen. It's a myth. It's an invention. And I think it does not do Joan any favors. I understand that she has kind of shrugged about the movie. We've never talked about it. I really don't know. But she did not bump Susie and come in, and it's just not real. My big thing about the movie, incidentally, is Dave. David does not have the fame of Bob and Joan, although in recent years he's become somebody mentioned in the press all the time as so-and-so learned from him. People all learn from him. But they have Bob coming to New York, and they have Dave greeting him. And that's it. You see Dave once more at a party where he's playing in folk music. And I am not big on symbolism. I'm kind of lousy on symbolism, actually. But this is very clear. What they are saying, in effect, is Bob is coming. Dave greets him. You never see Dave again. You never see any of the young people, any of the young folk singers at all. They were all cut out, which was a choice that the producers made. But you never see Dave again. And symbolically, what that is saying is that Bob is coming to replace Dave. And that's not what happened. I mean, something else happened. The other thing that I really resent is that and this involves Joan, they have a scene the night of the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were all terrified. My political acumen told me that nothing bad was going to happen. It was all going to be worked out. But I still called my parents for in case we got bombed. Everybody was terrified. So the movie has people running around in the village with suitcases, trying to get taxis. It has Bob playing in Gaslight. It has Joan running down to see Bob from Boston to be safe with him, which was crap. It didn't happen. What bothers me the most, and I think they did the Cuban Missile Crisis night very well. It's a little hysterical, but it was, that's not physically what it was like, but it gives you an idea of how scared people were. But the problem with that whole scene is that they have Bob playing in the Gaslight that night. He didn't. Dave was playing in the Gaslight that night. And I was there, Danny Kalb was there, Tom Paxton was there, friends were there. They erased Dave. They could have put Bob anywhere. They could have put him in another club and a concert and anything. I am very angry at what they did because they went, clock, bye.
Did any, when they were making that movie, did they ever contact you?
No, I know nothing about it.
Might have been rather helpful, as involved as you were. Now, Dylan goes on, of course, to write some tremendous songs, protest songs that, and actually he and Joan Baez were on the platform in August of 1963 when Martin Luther King gave his speech to the hundreds of thousands of people at the Lincoln Memorial. You were there that day, apparently. What was that like that day?
It was a very exciting day. I was there. David was supposed to play there. He was supposed to perform. And he was very, very sick. We never knew what happened, but he was very sick. But he insisted that I go. It was a day he said it's a day you shouldn't miss. So I was flown down with the performers. It was a very exhilarating day. It was, there was a feeling of hope at that time. I think it was somewhat misleading because there had been a lot of tension, a lot of difficulties about what was going to be promoted at that day, which we did not then know about. I knew about a little about it because I had some friends who worked in the office, the Martin Washington office, and what came out of it, a lot of stuff did not come out of it. Yeah. But the day itself felt like something was going to come out of it.
It was a tremendous day, and I think it made a difference. But as the years went on, we know that Bob Dylan became increasingly uneasy about the focus on him as a political icon, and he began to move away from that. Isolated himself, went in a lot of different directions musically, and yet people still were demanding that of him. And I think Joan Baez wrote 2 songs about him, at least 2 songs. One, of course, is Diamonds and Rust. But I think the other one, and I want to quote from it, it was a lovely song called Winds of the Old Days. And if I can quote, as of course she's singing about Bob Dylan. Breath on an undying ember, it doesn't take much to remember. Those eloquent songs from the good old days that set us to marching with banners ablaze. But reporters, there's no use in prying. Our blue-eyed son's been denying the truths that are wrapped in a mystery. The 60s are over, so set him free. Singer or savior, it was his to choose. Which of us knows what was his to lose? So thank you for writing the best songs. Thank you for writing a few wrongs. You're a savage gift and a wayward bus, but you stepped down and you sang to us. I've always found that song moving because I think it reflects what we couldn't know at the time about what he was going through and how uncomfortable it was for him. Did you get any sense of that as he began to sort of move away from the folk scene and into other areas?
Bob started to write songs when he was still hanging around, the village, and we were all good friends. And he started writing political songs, the Lonesome Train, blank of Hattie Carroll, and stuff like that. Bob came, and this is something that we did, Dave and I certainly understood. Bob came out of the rock world. Bob did not come out of folk music. Bob didn't, Bob, Bob, Bob was a huge Little Richard fan when he was in school. I think he showed very good taste, incidentally. Um, Bob, when Bob started writing songs, a handful of people were doing that. They were not just playing the old folk songs, they were writing their own. He did start writing political songs, but he, after about a year and a half, Bob started writing metaphor, which no one else was doing. And I think Blowing in the Wind certainly is the best example I can think of that in the early days. Bob was not writing about the inside of his own head like so many of the young folk singers were. He wasn't writing, come to, I want to be in bed with you, I want to be in love with you, I want you to hug me, I want you to kiss me, which a lot of the young people were doing. He was not writing rousing songs to bring the masses together, as Pete Seeger always did. He was studying Rimbaud. He was looking at art. He was learning about Brecht. He became friends with Jack Kerouac, with Allen Ginsberg. He was interested in the beat poets who were interested in imagery. He became fairly quickly the most prolific of the younger songwriters around. And I mean, just in terms of volume and intensity, outpacing anyone else. And yes, you certainly, I mean, those of us who knew him pretty well certainly could see that he was moving out of the realm of traditional songs, political songs, labor songs, narrative, which I always personally loved, blues, which he was incorporating into what he was writing. So, yeah, it was very clear that he was sort of moving on, and I mean, I managed him for only about 6 months, and then he left me for Albert Grossman, who was a big manager, very commercial manager, created Peter, Paul, and Mary, and was able to go to people and say, you book Bob Dylan if you want Peter, Paul, and Mary. I couldn't do anything like that. And John Hammond is a famous jazz record producer, thought he was great, and signed him to Columbia. And there was just this thing about Bob that change was going on.
Yeah. Well, I think his life has been to some degree about change, but I think in your book you have captured or written about a very special time in certainly in the history of New York City, the history of folk music, maybe in the history of America. And I think it's an important book for anyone who remembers that time or would like to learn more about that time. So we would like to thank you for sharing those very special memories and life experiences that you've had, and we wish you well, and keep the flame burning.
I thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to people. I really do.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Please join us on the next episode of Meet the Author. Thank you.